Well, welcome everybody to the June meeting of the Mornington Peninsula Astronomical Society, again done pre-recorded during the period of COVID lockdowns yet again this year. Now, some interesting things in tonight's meeting, but first of all we'll go through what's actually happened in the previous month and then go into the content of the meeting. So during the month we had Jeff Bezos announced that he and his brother, he's the founder of Amazon, are going into space in the next month or so, and they were auctioning off a third seat on their flight aboard the Blue Origin craft. It's the first time it's ever carried other than cargo passengers, and so consequently there is some risk associated with it. It's not going fully into outer space, but it will go up to what's given as the limit of outer space, being 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface, so known as the Kármán line. And this is the first flight of the Blue Origin craft shown in the picture. Very promptly afterwards, Sir Richard Branson of Virgin Galactic announced that he would beat them into space by about 2 weeks, up to the same altitude, even though both of them are only going to be from launch to coming back to Earth only about 7 minutes. They are strictly speaking in space, and Richard Branson announced that his space plane, Virgin Galactic, was going to beat them by 2 weeks to get there. So it remains to be seen who does actually get there first. So a bit of a space race into at least low orbit for opening up joyrides for tourists. This is not high enough to actually reach the International Space Station, which is about 4 times higher than what they are going to, but fun and games, and very, very interesting different craft to get there. Also announced was something about the International Space Station, which is a collaboration between nations, primarily America and Russia, but obviously others from the European Space Agency and other agencies around the world as well. But the primary partners are America and Russia. Russia announced that it was considering pulling out, primarily because of a shortage of certain microchips that American sanctions were starting to bite on them. And you'll see in the picture on the screen there the altitude of the International Space Station above the Earth, shown in the graph there, and it goes up and down, and every now and again, as the space station starts to come down to Earth under the drag that is inevitably there even in low Earth orbit, they have to boost it back up again to make sure that it stays up and doesn't re-enter and come crashing down to Earth, which of course would be potentially very disastrous, given the thing is about the size of a football field. What the Russians were actually threatening to do was withdraw from the International Space Station, and unfortunately the part of the space station that propels them up into higher orbit to overcome this decay is actually in the Russian zone. So that in itself would present an interesting problem for those remaining, if indeed the Russians decided to pull the plug and leave the International Space Station. In fact, they announced that if they do withdraw, they'll have their own space station up in orbit by 2030. And so consequently there might be a bit of competition, given that the Chinese are going for a space station as well. Also during the month was the NASA Juno spacecraft, which has been around Jupiter for a few years now, had a very close encounter with the largest moon of Jupiter, Ganymede. And on the 7th of June it came flying by at an altitude of 1,038 kilometers, which is not very high at all. It's flying by at speeds of up to about 58 kilometers per second, so sort of from here to Melbourne in about a second or under a second, so very, very quick. But it took a quick snapshot as it did go by on this initial flight, and the image showing on the front screen there is about 1 pixel to about 1 kilometre. It's currently black and white, but no doubt in coming days there'll be other images come by, taken in other filters and being combined then at that stage to give colour images. But you see the very typical appearance on the screen there of Ganymede, sort of appearing a bit pockmarked, and certainly very different from the other moons of Jupiter as well that have been visited. Now the Juno spacecraft is that triangular looking one that is shown there on the right hand side. Now also announced during the month was that NASA has decided to go back to Venus again in a few years' time. And Venus, of course, a very inhospitable planet, very, very hot, very, very high pressures and corrosive atmosphere. The Russians have attempted to land many craft on Venus, and they succeeded with a couple of craft that were destroyed fairly swiftly by the conditions that they found on Venus. But at least they managed to transmit back some initial pictures many years ago of the surface of Venus. Now this particular craft actually beat another couple of spacecraft missions that NASA was planning on sending to out to the solar system. So instead of going to Venus, the other ones competing with NASA for this one were one that was going to Io, being the closest large moon to Jupiter, was going to be a volcanic explorer there, and another one that was beaten by the mission to Venus was the Trident mission, which was going to Triton, one of Neptune's large moons that is thought to have a significant ocean actually below the surface. So two craft, Da Vinci and Veritas, have won the race there as far as NASA budgets goes. And shortly afterwards, the European Space Agency also announced that they're going back to Venus in 2030 or shortly thereafter, with what they refer to as the Envision mission. So I don't think any of those are by any means looking at having a human presence on Venus at any time in the foreseeable future, but more about, I think, learning some of the conditions on Venus and what might have happened to make it so very, very different from the Earth. The Americans have decided to declassify some of their unidentified flying object reports from their military, and three of the ones shown on this screen here were taken by naval aircraft in the US. And whether or not you think that they are drones, which is of course the more likely scenario, or whether or not they're weather balloons moving very, very quickly, or something more out of the ordinary, I'll leave to you, but certainly by the looks of it they look like craft of some sort, probably remotely operated. The one on the far right hand side was actually sent into MPAS a couple of weeks ago by some observers up in Albury, and we thank them for sending that amongst much other footage that they were taken as well. And I'll leave it up to you to decide what this one is, but those familiar with looking at the night sky through significant lenses such as on telescopes will recognize the telltale features of optics not being fully either collimated or out of focus. And in fact, if you look carefully here, that the chances are that this camera that has taken the image is just basically out of focus and is struggling to actually focus on infinity. Now the curious thing about this one is that it was reported towards the south, relatively low down. So it's not sort of in the right direction of any planets, but of course it is possible that the direction has been mistaken, because unfortunately there's nothing in the image to actually indicate the direction that it was actually pointing. And as you'll notice, as the captured object gets larger, you'll start to see some of the flaws in the optics, which is indeed suggesting that the camera was hunting for infinity and didn't quite get there by any stretch of the imagination. But this is fairly typical of reports of UFOs, and almost always it's never captured on film, so at least this person was somewhat mystified by what they saw and sent it in for a bit of an explanation of what they saw, but certainly not in the same category as the US Navy's ones, where they have obviously very experienced pilots in terms of what they're able to observe and explain.
Dude, there's a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. Oh my gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is the LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at that thing. It's rotating.
Now, for tonight, welcome to any new members. Unfortunately, we can't be face-to-face because of the current COVID restrictions. Restricts us down to 10 people at most, and only those within a 25-kilometre radius of the Briars. So hence we're back to pre-recording at this month. So hopefully things will relax a bit more for next month. So as usual, we'll go through what the events are of the past and the coming months, and then we'll look into an investigation that was put together by a previous MPAS member who has written a lot about interesting stories around Melbourne, not necessarily to do with restricted to do with space and anything unusual, but just really curious and debunking type stories as part of Melbourne Marvels. And Eamonn Gunning is his name, will talk about the disappearance of Frederick Valentich. Those of you who are my age or thereabouts may indeed remember this one as a UFO sighting over Melbourne in 1978, and one that never really has been successfully resolved in many people's minds, primarily because no wreckage of the aircraft was ever found, but certainly an interesting story. And Eamonn has gone into not only the background of it, but recently released material from the appropriate government department. And after that we'll add on some there about Peter Lowe, past president of MPAS, who also has a connection to this story through his previous love of flying. Following that, we have Sky for the Month, given by Mark, and he's pulled together what is in the night sky of known origins for the current and upcoming month. After that, sort of on unidentified objects in the sky theme, we introduce a new speaker, Dr. Sabine Hossenfelder from Germany, speaking about whatever happened to claims of life on Venus, which some of you may have seen in the media a few months ago, and what actually happened to that in subsequent looking at the data. Then she'll also talk about the history of false alien discoveries in the past, to make you think twice about anything that you before you jump to a conclusion of presence of aliens on Earth. Then we start to look into why do we actually see things that aren't there in the sky, and how to tell science from pseudoscience, and a little bit about cognitive biases that can affect all of us as well, especially as observers, based on what we're familiar with seeing. Then at the end of tonight's meeting, we'll close with more lights in the sky. But this one, a NASA video released actually in 8K, not that you'll see it here in 8K resolution, of the Aurora Australis and the Aurora Borealis as seen from the International Space Station in orbit, so looking downwards on it. And that will be played to Pachelbel's cannon in the background as well. So on to tonight. We'll begin with recent events in the Society. Obviously we've had some COVID cancellations. We did manage to have a members working bee at the Briars on the 22nd of May before the next set of lockdowns came into place. Then, alas, our initial viewing night at Mount Erin Secondary College in Frankston had to be cancelled due to the next wave of COVID outbreaks occurring. The night after, on the 26th of May, the lunar eclipse, a special public night at the Briars, had to be pulled back to be a members only night, but fortunately it was able to proceed for the Briars with the public absent and members only, for those keen to try and capture the circumstances of this lunar eclipse. A couple of days later we had the next Scout Cubs and Guys nights due at the Briars, and unfortunately we had to call that off due to the lockdown. And those 28 Scouts that were coming along will undoubtedly tack on to a later Scout Cubs and Guys night later in the year. Committee had an early meeting by Zoom shortly thereafter during the lockdown, and we were talking about not only the plans of what to do during this current COVID outbreak, but also about the audiovisual grant that we were able to secure from the federal government. And with that we're hoping to actually get ahead and deck out the inside of the auditorium at the Briars with some more modern and flexible gear than what we actually have at the moment. The next cancellation due to the lockdown was at Mount Eliza Secondary College, who were coming along to the Briars. Unfortunately they were also caught up in last year's lockdown period, and unfortunately they were caught this year as well, but no doubt they'll arrange something either later in the year or potentially next year. Then alas, during the lockdown period, our first work experience student, Year 10 work experience student for this year, had to be cancelled because of the lockdown arrangements and 25-kilometre radius. She was actually coming from a high school in Cranbourne. Then public stargazing night at the Briars on the 4th of June obviously had to be called off due to the current lockdown situation as well. And to try and address that, we've actually set up an additional viewing night in July, assuming all goes back to being fairly normal at that stage, and giving first priority to those members of the public who were actually booked on that 4th of June night. So coming up in the next month, all being well, we'll have a members working bee and barbecue at the Briars on the 19th of June. However, if the lockdown has extended past that time, then alas, that will be called off closer to the day, depending on what the coronavirus restrictions are in place on the 19th of June. We have a second work experience student, Year 10 work experience student, lined up to begin on the 21st of June, and as that stands, they're still on track for going ahead at the Briars. This one is actually from Mount Erin Secondary as well, whereas the previous one that unfortunately had to be cancelled was from Cranbourne. And this one from Mount Erin is also the school that was called off as well last week due to the COVID lockdown. So fingers crossed for the second one for the year. 23rd of June had the committee meeting scheduled to go ahead, all being well, and it will be at 7:30 p.m. As well at this stage. Then on the 2nd of July, the next public stargazing talk will go ahead, and we're due to have Manfred give a second talk at the public stargazing night, and that's currently booked out with at least 50 booked in at this stage. The next night afterwards is the special one that we've added to try and make up for the one missed in June due to the coronavirus lockdown. It's currently half booked and remains to be seen if it fully books in time. Given it's a different day of the week, it may be not as convenient to those in June who had booked. And at this stage, Trevor is down for talking at that one. Then coming up a little bit later in July, the July meeting on the third Wednesday of July is going to be the annual general meeting of the Society, where a new committee is voted in. So if you are interested in coming onto committee in any way, now is your chance. The nomination forms will go out in the next copy of Scorpius that gets posted online, and indeed an email will come round the eScorpius group for all members to apply if they wish to come onto committee. Following that will then be followed the usual July meeting of the Society. Hopefully it will be at the Briars. If for some reason it can't be at the Briars, then it will be online, and the AGM part will obviously have to be live to enable any voting to occur, if indeed that is necessary. And then our next Scout Cubs and Guides viewing night at the Briars, Stargazing night at the Briars, is scheduled for 30th of July. Fingers crossed that there's no issues with that one. We're scheduled for Manfred to give the talk for that one as well, and we currently have no bookings, and if for some reason it stays like that, then these Scout nights will get cancelled a couple of days beforehand. So for tonight's meeting, we have Eamonn Gunning, a previous member of MPAS and a long time private author about interesting events that have occurred around the Melbourne region. Certainly doesn't stick to only astronomical things, so he has written about the Cranbourne meteorite and other things. You may wish to check out his website and blog online. Just search for Melbourne Marvels to hear some of the interesting stories that are around the Melbourne region. And this particular one is used by permission of Eamonn, and tonight's is talking about the mysterious disappearance of Frederick Valentich back in 1978, whereby he disappeared in an apparent UFO incident. Eamonn goes into the background of it and also fills us in with the latest released materials that came from that case, from the Department of Transport, or whichever government department is now responsible for that. Following that, Peter Lowe will give an update actually on the Valentich case, because he has a personal connection there for his previous love of flying, and that will be a very interesting conclusion, because it takes Eamonn's talk just a little bit further as well, and gives a bit more of an update. So well worth listening to both of those talks, given that they are probably the #1 UFO story out of Victoria that I certainly ever recall hearing, because the remains of the aircraft were actually never found. And a very interesting end to the story from Peter as well.
On the 21st of October 1978, 20-year-old Frederick Valentich is flying a Cessna 182L light aeroplane from Moorabbin Airport to King Island. Not long after commencing the overwater section of the flight between Cape Otway and King Island, at 7:06 in the evening, just before sunset, Valentich contacts air services at Tullamarine Airport with an unexpected request. "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000 feet? Working that evening for air services is Steve Roby, whose job it is to control air traffic outside of restricted airspace. Roby quickly confirms in the negative that there should be no traffic before Valentich continues. There seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. Roby asks Valentich what type of aircraft it is before the young pilot replies, I cannot affirm. It is 4 bright, it seems to me like landing lights. Here he pauses for a few seconds before adding, the aircraft has just passed over me at least 1,000 feet above. Roby asks Valentich if it is a large aircraft, and the young man replies, unknown, due to the speed it's travelling. Is there any Air Force aircraft in the vicinity? Roby replies in the negative, and a few seconds later, Valentich says, it's approaching now from due east towards me. About 30 seconds pass as Valentich observes the mysterious craft, before he adds, it seems to me that he's playing some sort of game. He's flying over me 2-3 times at a time, at speeds I could not identify. Roby asks Valentich what his altitude is, and the 20-year-old replies that he is at 4,500 feet. The flight services officer then asks the young pilot to confirm that he cannot identify the aircraft. Affirmative, Valentich replies. Some seconds pass before Valentich says, it's not an aircraft, it's... Roby then asks Valentich if he can describe the aircraft. Valentich answers with, as it's flying past, it's a long shape. Cannot identify more than that it has such speed. Before me right now, Melbourne. Roby interrupts the pilot here as he says, Roger, and how large would the object be? A few moments pass before Valentich gives his response. It seems like it's stationary. What I'm doing right now is orbiting, and the thing is just orbiting on top of me. Also, it's got a green light, and sort of metallic-like. It's all shiny on the outside. 20 seconds later, Valentich holds down the microphone for 5 seconds before adding, it's just vanished. A few seconds later, he asks Roby if he would know what type of aircraft he's got. Is it a military aircraft? Roby asks Valentich to confirm that the aircraft has just vanished, but Valentich doesn't hear this message and asks Roby to repeat it, which Roby does. Valentich must see the craft again at this point though, as he says, now approaching from the southwest. Distressingly, about 30 seconds later, Valentich reports, the engine is rough idling. I've got it set at 23, 24, and the thing is coughing. Roby responds, Roger, what are your intentions? The next reply Valentich speaks down the microphone is the last thing Valentich is known to have spoken to another human being. My intentions are to go to King Island. Melbourne, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It is hovering and it's not an aircraft. The audio tape of this conversation has never been released to the public, as it is classified by the Department of Transport. The Department of Transport did, however, release the final 17 seconds of Valentich's call before he and his light aircraft disappeared and were never heard from again. The following is those final 17 seconds. Frederick Valentich went missing that day, and despite protracted air, land and sea searches, neither he nor his Cessna 182L DSJ have ever been found. Frederick Valentich was born in Melbourne on June 9, 1958, to Italian immigrant parents Guido and Alberta Valentich, who hailed from the multicultural city of Trieste in the northeast of the country. Fred was the eldest of 4 children, who included his younger brother Ricky and his younger twin sisters Olivia and Lara. The family lived in the Melbourne suburb of Avondale Heights, where they enjoyed a happy suburban life like many other European immigrant families who lived in the same area. In 1974, Fred left school after completing Year 10 at Keilor Heights High School. While he was noted as being an excellent athlete by his PE teacher, his results in his other subjects were all average or below average, and he failed both of the math subjects he took that year. However, he did not want to let this stop him from fulfilling his dream of joining the Royal Australian Air Force, or the RAAF. Unfortunately for Fred, his poor academic results from school and his performance in the entrance examination he took for entry into the RAAF in 1976 meant that he failed in his application. An examiner noted about Fred's test results, quote, "Very low scores, indicative low IQ, fit for unskilled work only," end quote. While disappointed with failing in his application to the RAAF, Fred was determined to prove that he could still become a civilian pilot, and so in February of 1977 he gained his student's pilot license, with a view to later gaining his commercial pilot's license. Throughout 1977, Fred took and failed many of the testing components that are prerequisites for gaining one's CPL. While he passed many of these components at subsequent attempts, he failed all 5 of his CPL theory exams in both October 1977 and April 1978. Despite failing in his attempts to become a commercial pilot, throughout 1978, Fred possessed the legal documentation required to pilot single-engine Cessna aircraft by himself and carry passengers. While he continued to study for another attempt at the CPL examinations throughout 1978, Fred built up his flying hours by flying light aeroplanes out of Moorabbin Airport on weekends. Meanwhile, after Fred had failed all his CPL examinations in April of 78, he requested assistance from one Edwin Robert Barnes, a squadron leader attached to the Air Training Corps that Fred was studying in. Fred had begun volunteering for no pay at the Air Training Corps in order to gain more experience. Barnes saw his enthusiasm for his work, and after Fred requested the squadron leader become his private tutor, Barnes agreed to help him in navigation and aircraft performance. Thus, Fred would regularly visit Barnes at his home on Sundays for his lessons, where Barnes was impressed with Fred's enthusiasm and politeness. Barnes noted that while Fred was particularly bad at spelling, he felt that the young man had the capability and responsibility required to pass his next examinations in July of that year. Barnes further noted that Fred was, quote, "of sober habits," and never partook in the consumption of more than one alcoholic beverage on the evenings in question. In July of 1978, Fred took 2 of his 5 CPL examinations for the 3rd time, and the following Sunday he turned up to Barnes's home with his girlfriend Rhonda Rushton and 2 bottles of wine, saying he wished to celebrate, as he believed he had passed his 2 examinations. Barnes declined a drink because he was on reserve and told Fred that he would drink them when he was told that he had passed all of his exams. In September of 78, Barnes returned from a holiday and received a telephone call from Fred in which the trainee pilot informed him that he had passed all 5 of his CPL examinations. Fred had in fact failed 3 examinations for the 3rd time and not taken the final 2. A fact Barnes only discovered after Fred's disappearance, when the Air Safety Investigation Branch, or ASIB, of the Department of Transport wrote to him to request his assistance in providing a character reference for Fred. In his letter to ASIB, Barnes expressed extreme disappointment at Fred's dishonesty and wondered whether Fred's failure had something to do with his disappearance. Throughout 1978, Fred was dating the formerly mentioned 16-year-old girl, Rhonda Rushton. On a number of occasions, she had flown with Fred, and she considered her boyfriend to be a diligent and responsible pilot who understood the importance of being disciplined while flying. About 2 months before his disappearance, they had flown together to Newcastle. On the return flight, Fred had accidentally strayed into restricted airspace in the Sydney suburb of Bankstown. Rhonda later recalled that Fred had become extremely agitated during this incident and remembered using a handkerchief to dab the sweat off his forehead. Fred received a letter reprimanding him for this incident for his poor navigation skills. When Rhonda was interviewed by the Department of Transport 3 days after Fred's disappearance, investigators were keen to understand Fred's mental state in the days leading up to the 21st. While Rhonda told the interviewers that Fred was a very sober young man, rarely drinking more than 2 beers on nights out, she also mentioned a couple of things which stood out to the investigators as unusual. Firstly, about 1 week before the incident, she and Fred had driven out to the Dandenong Ranges, where they had discussed the topic of UFOs, and Fred had said, quote, "If a UFO landed in front of me now, I would go in it, but never without you," end quote. When pressed as to whether UFOs were a topic he often discussed or was heavily interested in, she said that they had talked about them only occasionally, and never in any depth, and denied that he was any more interested in them than the average person. The interviewer also claimed that Rhonda said she had seen newspaper clippings of UFOs that Fred kept as a hobby, something she denied 40 years later when questioned about this at an anniversary event held by the Victorian UFO Action Group. Furthermore, according to Rhonda, Fred had lied to her previously about passing his meteorology subject. According to her, he had told her this false information when he first met her, but that 4 months later he had admitted to his lie. But perhaps the most significant piece of information that Rhonda later revealed was that the weekend prior to his disappearance, 2 days before the trip to the Dandenong Ranges mentioned previously, Fred had asked Rhonda to marry him. According to her, he had proposed to her and given her a friendship ring, which was to be replaced at a later date by a more expensive ring, which he had placed on lay-by. He told her she could keep the friendship ring until he had enough money to pay the amount owing on the more expensive ring on lay-by at a jeweller's near where he worked in Moonee Ponds. He also told Rhonda to keep the engagement secret because he didn't want to announce it until he had enough money to pay out the remainder of the lay-by, which he was planning to do that Christmas. Furthermore, he had planned to be engaged to her for 1 year because Rhonda was to turn 17 in the December, and then after 1 year she would be 18 and she would have reached the legal age for marriage. On the one hand, Fred's plans to marry Rhonda may well be seen by some to be a sign of a young man who was looking forward to the future. On the other hand, his tutor, Edwin Robert Barnes, in his letter to the Department of Transport, saw his actions in proposing to Rhonda and giving her a temporary friendship ring as the behaviour of someone who was acting very strangely indeed, and wondered whether he did it because he had planned to commit suicide on the 21st of October. Years later, at the 40th anniversary event of the incident held by the Victorian UFO Action Group at Moorabbin Airport in 2018, Rhonda told a live audience that the Department of Transport had asked her some extremely inappropriate personal questions, the nature of which she was not willing to disclose. Needless to say, this would be very unprofessional behaviour by a government department when questioning the grieving girlfriend of a missing man, especially since she was just 16 years old at the time and not accompanied by her parents. In addition, while she was being interviewed, she felt intimidated because a bright spotlight was shone in her face throughout so that she could not see who was interviewing her. On the evening prior to Fred's disappearance, Fred visited Rhonda at her home in Preston at about 9:15 p.m. Rhonda told the DOT in her interview that Fred wasn't his usual cheerful self that evening and appeared as though something was bothering him. According to the DOT interview report of Rhonda's interview, he had agreed to take her out on the Saturday night after he returned from his flight. Quote, "In their conversation, it became evident to her that he had forgotten he had agreed to take her out on Saturday night. The forthcoming flight to King Island was discussed, and together they evolved the schedule of departure. Moorabbin 4 o'clock, land King Island 5:30 p.m, pick up crayfish, leave 6 o'clock, land Moorabbin 7:30 p.m. As it was a 20-minute drive from the airport to Preston, she suggested Valentich put his good clothes in which to take her out in his car when he left home early on Saturday. Since the aircraft went missing, she had seen the car at Moorabbin and was aware that no clothes were in it." End quote. There are a couple of strange things about this information. Firstly, it is at least a 40-minute drive from Moorabbin Airport in Cheltenham to Preston. But more significantly, Rhonda now denies that she ever told the investigators that she told Fred to put his good clothes in his car. She denies that they had agreed for him to pick her up at her house in Preston to go out that night. In fact, at the 40-year anniversary event, Rhonda Rushton spoke publicly that she and Fred had agreed to fly to King Island together, that later they were going to go out for dinner to celebrate their 6-month anniversary together. In fact, in its final report summary, written on the 24th of August 1981, almost 2 years after the incident, investigator Barry Mahoney also made a slanderous accusation about Rhonda with the following comment, quote, "Frederick's girlfriend seemed to enjoy the publicity limelight surrounding the disappearance. She did not appear to be unduly concerned and gave the impression that she expected to see him again." End quote. Fred's father, Guido Valentich, was interviewed by the Department of Transport on October 25, 1978, the day after Rhonda Rushton's interview. Among other things, he told them that Fred was a firm believer in UFOs and had read the book Chariots of the Gods, Unsolved Mysteries of the Past by Swiss author Ulrich von Daniken. Published in 1968, the central tenet of the book was that many of the technological advances made by ancient civilizations were introduced to them by extraterrestrial beings. Furthermore, Guido told the investigators that Fred's beliefs in UFOs had not long ago been strengthened during a recent camping trip he had made to Gippsland with the Air Training Corps, when he had been allowed to view the RAAF's secret files on UFOs. However, Fred had refused to reveal the contents of those files to his family, as they were classified, and he took his duty not to reveal its contents very seriously. Guido also told the investigators that Fred's mother, Alberta, had recently seen a UFO and had called Fred, and he had seen it too. They described it as a large light, its size about 10 times that of the largest star. The object had remained stationary for some time before shooting off at a high speed. While Guido had not been present during this incident himself, his wife and son's explanation of it convinced him that UFOs were real, and that the planet was regularly being visited by some sort of extraterrestrial intelligence. Lastly, Guido revealed that Fred had worried about attack by UFOs, so his father had attempted to assuage his fears by telling him that if aliens did attack, there was nothing they could do, so there would be no point in worrying about it. According to Guido, Fred had gone to bed at about 10:30 on the night of the 20th of October 1978. In the morning, he had a light breakfast of coffee, orange juice and cereal with his family. He then drove to Puckle Street in Moonee Ponds, where he worked as the assistant manager of an army disposal shop, a store which specializes in camping and outdoor equipment. He started his shift here at 9 a.m. before finishing at noon, when he immediately drove from Moonee Ponds to Moorabbin Airport, where he had his first lecture at 1 p.m. This meant that he would not have had time to get lunch before the start of his classes. Meanwhile, at Moorabbin Airport that morning, Vince Alfonso carried out the daily inspection of the Cessna 182 DH-VSJ Fred would later that day fly to King Island. The inspection was begun before 6 a.m. when Alfonso flew the aircraft to French Island as part of the routine examination that was to check the performance of the aeroplane. Alfonso noted the plane performed, quote, okay. There was a smell emanating from the heater, which soon dissipated, but this was not considered unusual. More alarmingly, on the return flight to Moorabbin Airport, a passenger noticed fuel emanating from the fuel tank on the right-hand side of the aircraft. After landing, it was discovered that the cap was out of the tank and hanging from the chain. So Alfonso reported this anomaly to Southern Air Services, the company with whom the aircraft was registered. The next morning, when discussing the disappearance of Fred at Southern Air Services, he discovered that the cap had been repaired before Fred's flight. Fred's classes finished at 5 p.m, after which he headed to the briefing office to submit his flight plan. Fred lodged the flight plan at 5:23 p.m, and it stated a takeoff time of 5:45 p.m. However, he did not actually take off until later, as he was so hungry, having not eaten anything since morning. Later, both Rhonda and Guido told investigators, as it was his normal practice to do so, he would have driven to the local McDonald's restaurant on the Nepean Highway, near the Southland Shopping Centre, and eaten a large meal that usually consisted of, quote, 2 Big Macs, 2 cheeseburgers, a fillet of fish, and some chips, and most likely would have drunk a carton of Coca-Cola. Rhonda later said she believed Fred would have gotten takeaway and would have driven his car to the beach where he would have eaten his large meal while looking out to sea. It is believed Fred took the Cessna for refueling at 6:10 p.m. and waited inside the aircraft as it was being refueled by mechanic Ronald Tyson. Once done, he was given the okay for takeoff. Crucially, Fred did not actually take off from Moorabbin Airport until 6:19 p.m, a full 34 minutes after he had indicated he would in the flight plan. This meant that by the time his Cessna was to arrive at King Island, the sun would have set and it would be almost completely dark. Despite this, Fred made no phone call to the airport on the island, requesting them to turn on the runway landing lights, as was standard procedure at the time. In fact, there were a number of contradictions in what Fred told to different people in regards to his intentions for this flight. In the days after the incident, the Department of Transport was told by Bob Hope, an instructor with Southern Air Services, that Fred had told him on the day that he had planned to pick people up on King Island. He also told Darcy Hogan, his briefing officer, that he was going to pick up passengers on the island, but no such passengers existed. Yet, according to the Department of Transport, he had told Guido and his friend Greg Reburn that he was picking up crayfish on the island. This was also strange, as the cray fisherman on the island, Cliff Day, said he had no contact with Fred regarding the procurement of any crayfish, and that they had sold out of crayfish early in the afternoon anyway. It is believed Fred flew towards Frankston before heading out over Port Phillip Bay towards Point Lonsdale. From here, Fred flew along the coastline towards Cape Otway, which he reached at 7 p.m. Here he contacted Steve Roby at Air Services in Tullamarine Airport by radio to inform him he was commencing the overwater section of his flight. Fred had been flying for 6 minutes over the open water before his contact with Steve Roby, in which he inquired about whether there was, quote, any known traffic below 5,000 feet, end quote. The 17 seconds of indecipherable static that is heard at the end of the tape occurred at 7:12 p.m. It is not known what happened to Fred's plane, but if he did crash into the ocean at this point, and assuming he was flying in a largely straight line from Cape Otway, the crash site would have been located about 40 kilometers south-southeast of Cape Otway, not quite halfway to King Island. This, however, is disputed, as we shall see later. After the transmission of the 17 seconds at the end of the call from Fred's plane, Steve Roby made numerous attempts to communicate with Fred, but received no reply. He therefore initiated a safety measure known as an alert phase that would require a King Island flight service officer return to duty, as the last employee had gone home for the day at 5 o'clock. This alert phase also involved the activation of the island's emergency procedures, one of which included turning on the landing lights at the runway. When Fred's Cessna failed to arrive at King Island at 7:33 p.m, the distress phase was declared, and an immediate ground, sea and air search was commenced. Brian Jones, the officer in charge at King Island Airport, was called back to duty at 7:15 p.m. after the alert phase was initiated. He arrived at the airport and put the landing lights on at 7:35 p.m. At the same time that he arrived, his assistant Graham Smith also arrived to put the landing lights on for a Cessna that was flying out of the airport but had been delayed while waiting for passengers. This other Cessna was then used to fly around the island to search for Fred's plane. Despite the fact that there was excellent visibility and they could see all the way to the Cape Otway lighthouse, they did not sight Fred's plane. That night, a ship in the area was notified of the missing aircraft and conducted a search for Fred's plane, but did not see anything. Planes were also sent along the route Fred's aircraft took, but as it was night, it was difficult to spot anything in the darkness. With daylight, the search was given renewed impetus. One aircraft conducted a land search of the island and another a coastal search, but found nothing. 3 vessels searched off the west coast and islands of King Island, and the RAAF Orion searched off the north coast. An oil slick was found here, but no wreckage could be located. The next day, the vessel Nomad was sent to the area, and a sample of the oil slick was taken for testing to determine whether it could be from Fred's Cessna. However, later it was determined that the oil was not of the type that would come from an aircraft. Debris consisting of fruit and vegetable boxes was also located near this site, but this was determined not to be from Fred's Cessna 182L. A light aircraft also located some more debris to the northwest of King Island, but as this plane was not fixed with integral navigation systems, it needed to rise in altitude in order to sight land before fixing its position, and in doing so it lost sight of the debris and could not locate it again. After 3 full days of searching, the search and rescue operation by sea vessels was called off on the 25th of October. Nevertheless, volunteers and friends of Fred's continued to search by air and land. Many of Fred's friends felt that since no wreckage had been found in the ocean search, he must have turned the aeroplane round and crash-landed somewhere on the heavily forested Cape Otway Peninsula. Therefore, on the 26th, a group of his flying buddies travelled down to the region and spent a number of days performing flyovers and searching the area by foot, which was also to prove fruitless. The media became aware of the unusual nature of Fred's disappearance as soon as the search and rescue operation was put in place on the night of the 21st, and the general public was able to eavesdrop on the radio transmissions. This prompted the DOT to publicly release the transcript of the radio conversation between Fred and Air Services Controller Steve Roby on the 22nd. The fact that Fred had witnessed an unidentified aerial phenomenon right before he and his plane went missing became a huge story, and newspaper and radio journalists scrambled to interview all those who were close to Fred. On the 23rd of October, an article appeared in the Bendigo Advertiser titled, quote, "UFO took our boy, pilot's parents," end quote, detailing Guido and Alberta Valentich's belief that Fred may have been abducted by the UFO. The interview, which had been conducted on the evening of the 22nd, after the first full day's search had ended in failure, also explained that Guido and Alberta did not believe a proposed explanation that Fred may have turned the plane upside down or entered into an uncontrolled spiral after becoming disoriented. Fred's parents also expressed the view that the Department of Transport was attempting to cover up what really happened to their son. In the days after Fred's disappearance, it became evident that 1 month earlier, a woman had written a letter to the editor published in the King Island News on September 20th concerning recent accounts of unidentified aerial phenomena. It stated, quote, "We saw our first sighting 2 months ago. We were driving into Curry and a slow-moving light followed us down the North Road and finally disappeared toward the lighthouse. There were other sightings in Curry on the same night. Some people further up north also saw a strange light passing over their house. Then another told of seeing beautiful strange lights outside. On going out to investigate, the lights suddenly disappeared. Then last night, the strange light appeared again, just up from Camp Creek. On each of these occasions, the light has been very large and bright, and seems to light up the area as if it were daylight." End quote. Soon other stories of sightings of unexplained aerial phenomena emerged. A man by the name of John Snow contacted the Department of Transport investigators on the 23rd of October to inform them that at about 11:45 p.m. on the night of Fred's disappearance, his 11-year-old son had witnessed a long streak of greenish-white light flash across the sky to the south of the Barwon Heads area, about 120 kilometres from Cape Otway. A Mr. P. Farr of Burwood, an officer in the RAAF Reserve, contacted investigators to inform them that on the night in question, he had witnessed what he described as, quote, "a shower of very bright metallic scintillations to the south, high in the sky, about 30 bright centres," end quote. The Australian published an article describing a sighting by a technician who worked with the CSIRO named Wayne Bellew, who witnessed a UAP whilst camping with his wife. at Bateman's Bay, New South Wales on the night in question. He described seeing a, quote, bright white object performing wild stunts over the ocean. The thing was performing such incredible maneuvers that any conventional pilot who tried it would have been guts over kneecaps, end quote. In 1978, the RAAF were responsible for the reporting of what were called Unidentified Aerial Sightings, or UAS. Between October 21st and the end of 1978, dozens of UAS reports were made to them, with quite a few coming on the night of the 21st itself. Perhaps the most startling UAP sighting made on the night of Fred's disappearance came from a man named Don Cox and his wife from Valley View, South Australia, in a detailed letter to the RAAF. Describing a bright, shining object he and his wife witnessed from the garden of their home, he wrote in his letter, quote, "Having got my binoculars from within the house, I focused on this object. What I saw was a large triangular yellow-white light laying on its side, with one side of the triangle in a vertical position. Within this triangle were iridescent lights. I can only positively remember 3 of the colours, which were blue, blue-green and orange, but feel sure there were also others. My wife watched it for near enough 10 minutes, and myself for a total of roughly 45 minutes, before losing sight of it behind a large gum tree 2 gardens away. During the last stage of viewing this assortment of colours, it transformed into a V shape, still on its side, with the top half appearing to be the reflection of the lower portion, as one might view a boat sitting on the surface of the water. I reported this matter to Edinburgh Airport on 5:45 p.m. Monday the 23rd of October, and was told by a girl that this information would be passed on to the UFO investigations officer in the morning. By now I was aware I had seen word for word exactly as the missing Melbourne pilot, meaning Fred, had described. I rang again Edinburgh Airport the following day, October 24th, and spoke to an officer who told me he would try either to see me at my place of work or at my home in the evening. As by the following day, the 25th, he had not made the effort to interview me, I again phoned and told him of my concern, pleading with him to heed this information, which I felt so vital in the case of the missing pilot. After confirming my statement with my wife over the phone, this officer subsequently visited my home and took a signed statement from me along with a diagram of the 3 stages that this moving light had taken. I have no doubt in my mind that whatsoever I witnessed was exactly as the young pilot described who has gone missing. I am prepared to swear an oath or submit myself to any lie detector test to substantiate this my statement." End quote. 1 week after Fred's disappearance, Air Services Controller Steve Roby was involved in another UAP sighting incident. In the vicinity of Sale, Gippsland, a pilot reported seeing an extremely bright light heading from west to east. A few minutes later, the same pilot reported the same phenomenon and told Roby that if it happened again, he would land the aircraft. It happened again, an extremely bright light travelling quickly from west to east. This time it was travelling below him. As a result, the pilot landed the aircraft out of fear of being impacted by any similar objects. At the time, there was a military phone number that was provided to all services personnel to report such incidents. Roby contacted the number, and soon afterwards he was interviewed by a man from the military about the incident. Meanwhile, the Department of Transport set about investigating the cause of Fred's disappearance, an investigation that would not be completed for 2.5 years. It was this process that led to the interviewing of Fred's girlfriend Rhonda Rushton on the 24th of October, Fred's father Guido on the 25th of October, and many of Fred's friends and peers. As time went on and Fred and his plane were nowhere to be found, speculation mounted in the media as to whether the 6-minute transcript of the radio contact between Fred and Steve Roby was a full account of the conversation that transpired between the pair. Despite the fact a number of UAP research organisations based in both Australia and the United States wrote to the Department of Transport urging them to release the full audio tape recording of the conversation, the DOT responded by declaring it had never been its policy to release audio tapes related to accident investigations. In January 1979, Fred's father, Guido Valentich, wrote a letter to the director of the Department of Transport for the Victoria and Tasmania region, G. Hughes, requesting a copy of the audio tape of Fred's radio transmission with Steve Roby. The department privately expressed reluctance to release the tape, saying that it went against their normal procedures to release audio tapes from accident investigations, particularly ongoing investigations which had not yet concluded. Guido was suspicious that the department was trying to hide something, and believing that Fred had been abducted by an alien spacecraft, he requested the help of veteran American UFO researcher Paul Norman. Norman and Australian UFO researcher John Ockertell established a dialogue with the department on Guido's behalf and arranged a meeting with the DOT in which they requested a full unedited copy of the tape. The department, however, agreed only to supply an edited version, which only included the parts of the tape between 7:06 p.m. and 7:12 p.m, from when Fred had just reported the unusual aerial sighting until the final indiscernible 17 seconds. Furthermore, the edited tape would not include any of the parts of the tape in which Steve Roby was speaking, nor the part of the tape that was recorded prior to 7:06 p.m. While Guido and UFO researchers Ockertell and Norman tried to insist on the full tape, the DOT stuck to their guns, saying that this would not be possible as those other parts of the tape were deemed confidential, and it was only releasing the 6 minutes of Fred's voice out of sympathy to Guido and his family. Furthermore, they asked Guido to sign a document stating that he would not release the audio tape to the media, and that he was to play it for family members only. After much back and forth, in March 1979, the DOT finally released this edited version of the tape to Guido and the Valentich family. Paul Norman and John Ockertell were both members of VUFORS, or Victorian Unidentified Flying Object Research Society, a research group which professed an agnostic stance towards UFOs, but considered the phenomenon deserved closer scientific scrutiny than was offered by mainstream science or skeptical explanations for UFOs. While VUFORS was simply seeking all available evidence in order to find out the truth of what happened to Fred, the story was also ripe for charlatans and shysters to make a quick buck with pseudoscientific explanations and false narratives of what had become of the 20-year-old. On the 23rd of April 1979, an article by reporter David Elias appeared in The Australian, which detailed the claims of a New Zealand confidence trickster by the name of Colin Amory, who falsely claimed to be a clairvoyant. According to the article, Amory said that he had conducted a séance the previous Saturday, in which he had communed with Fred. Amory went on to say that Fred had told him during this séance that he had been, quote, taken by a community in space, and that the reason his aircraft had not been found is that it disappeared from any physical existence, end quote. Amory also reported that Fred had told him that 60 seconds of the radio transcript of his conversation with Steve Roby had been, quote, edited out and suppressed, end quote, and that Fred was, quote, safe but no longer has a physical body. I am in light but can move to wherever I want to be, end quote. Despite Amory's claims, others suggested that he was simply trying to publicize his book, New Atlantis, The Secret of the Sphinx, a book that, quote, looks forward to a new and golden age of Aquarius that will succeed the present cycle of chaos and destruction, end quote. In October 1979, Michael Fields, writing to the American magazine Ideal UFO Quarterly, made the false claim that the Department of Transport had released only an edited version of the true transcript, and published a story that they claimed was the true version of Fred's radio conversation with Steve Roby. Strangely, the narrative of this article was written like a long comic book story, but interspersed with some of the real dialogue from the transcript the Department of Transport had released 1 year previously. Furthermore, there were extra details included that were not in the original transcript, most notably the parts in which Fred describes the unidentified aerial phenomenon as being a 100 feet long tube with green gas emanating from it, windows showing lights on in the interior, and that just before the call ends in indecipherable noise, Fred reports suffering from a scorching pain. Local Melbourne-based charlatans also attempted to profit from Fred's story by giving credence to Ideal UFO Quarterly's bogus story. That same month, author John Pinckney, who has made a career out of writing books about ghosts, the supernatural and conspiracy theories, wrote an article published in Rupert Murdoch-owned Melbourne tabloid Truth. Now disbanded, Truth was a British-style weekly tabloid newspaper that contained photos of bare-breasted page 3 models and usually published sensational scoops on personal scandals. Pinckney's article was included in a section of the newspaper titled The Outer Limits, next to a photograph of him that was captioned, quote, "John Pinckney, Australia's leading UFO and supernatural investigator," end quote. The article reported on the publication of the story in Ideal UFO Quarterly, and Pinckney mysteriously concludes his article with the line, quote, "Some of the pilot's comments in the American magazine tally with notes I was given last October," end quote. Despite the publication of those two articles, Ideal UFO Quarterly's completely fictitious account was quickly dismissed by the one person who had first-hand knowledge of the nature of the conversation with Fred. Steve Roby himself has always maintained that the transcript released by the Department of Transport is exactly how the call played out. In 1980, a book named The Devil's Meridian, which included a section on the Valentage disappearance, was written by authors Kevin Killy and Gary Lester. The central thesis of the book was the idea that there was an area of the Bass Strait, the so-called Bass Strait Triangle, in which a number of unexplained disappearances of both ships and aircraft had occurred. It provided a historical analysis of other ships and aircraft that had gone missing without a trace in the previous 150 years. On the 28th of February 1981, Melbourne tabloid newspaper Truth published an article in which they claimed that a filmmaker by the name of Brian Morris intended to make an expensive documentary about Fred's disappearance. The article, by Brian Blackwell, stated that Morris intended to import the same type of Cessna 182L aircraft from the United States before hiring a helicopter to tow the plane over the Bass Strait and ditch it into the sea. The film was to be largely based on the previously mentioned book by Kevin Killy and Gary Lester, The Devil's Meridian. Morris stated that it was his intention to include an interview with former President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, who claimed to have seen a UFO. He also expressed his belief that the documentary would cost in the region of $600,000 to produce. It is not known what happened to Morris's film project, but it was never made. The Department of Transport finally released their Accident Investigation Report summary of the Valentage disappearance in August 1981. It stated that it could not be determined what happened to Frederick Valentage and his aircraft, but it did offer 5 possible hypotheses. 1. That Fred experienced disorientation, which caused him to crash the plane into the sea. However, it noted that if this had been the case, that it was unusual that there had been no wreckage discovered. 2. That Fred intentionally landed the Cessna on the sea before attempting to escape, either successfully or unsuccessfully. It implied that if this had been the case, the aircraft may have sunk to the bottom of the sea completely intact, either with or without Fred's body inside. 3. A controlled landing elsewhere. It suggested the possibility that Fred was not where he said he was, and that he may have intentionally deceived the public by intentionally landing elsewhere. 4. Crashing on land while attempting a controlled landing. It suggested this as a possibility, and that if this was the case, the wreckage simply had not been found yet. 5. UFO intervention. The DOT then falsely added to this item in a comment that is uncharacteristically speculative of a government department that there were, quote, "no sighting observations of a brightly illuminated craft large enough to take on board a Cessna 182, end quote. In fact, there were at least 15 sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena reported to either the Department of Transport investigators, news media, or the RAAF on the night in question. The summary report was delivered by hand to the Valentich family on the 12th of May 1982. A copy was also sent to the owner of the aircraft, Dr. C. Day, Southern Air Service, and the Victorian coroner that month. In 1982, the Air Safety Investigation Bureau, or ASIB, which had been a branch of the Department of Transport, had its name changed to the Bureau of Air Safety Investigation, BASI, an operationally independent unit, no longer of the Department of Transport, but now a branch of the Department of Aviation. In December 1982, Fred's father, Guido Valentich, received a telephone call from a filmmaker by the name of Ron Cameron. In the phone call, Cameron claimed that 2 divers had contacted him to inform him that they had located 3 or 4 aircraft wrecks off Cape Otway, and that they had identified one as Fred's Cessna 182L DSJ. Cameron claimed that the divers had requested $10,000 in return for revealing the location of Fred's plane. A story in the Herald evening newspaper on the 15th of December then elaborated on this story. Cameron claimed to have seen photographs taken of the underwater aircraft and believed one of them bore the same markings as Fred's plane. He further claimed that the photograph revealed the cockpit of the Cessna, but that Fred was not inside. Cameron told the newspaper that he intended to make a documentary film about the disappearance and conduct a salvage operation in recovering the aircraft. After this article was published, the Coroner's Court of Victoria contacted BASI, expressing concern that these private individuals were publicly declaring a desire to interfere with possible evidence in determining the cause of a deceased person. Therefore, in January 1983, Jay Sandercock, the director of BASI, contacted Ron Cameron to explain to him the sensitivity of the issue at hand and to arrange a meeting where he hoped to inform him that any salvage operation could only be carried out in the presence of both someone from the coroner's court and a member of BASI. Then, on the 11th of January 1983, on the day Sandercock was to meet Ron Cameron to discuss the salvage operation, another article appeared in the press, this time in The Sun, titled UFO Plane Photos Upset Father. In the article, written by John Beveridge, Guido expressed his dismay that the divers were attempting to profit from the salvage operation of Fred's plane. Filmmaker Ron Cameron was also interviewed again, where he stated, quote, "The plane was a little bit twisted, but in one piece. Once we get a line down to it, we will be able to bring it up to the surface in half a day." End quote. BASI director Jay Sandercock immediately cancelled his meeting with Ron Cameron on seeing the article, expressing disappointment that there had been so much media attention around the planned salvage operation. Then, according to Ron Cameron, the 2 divers pulled out of the deal to show him the location of the wreck, as they were unhappy that he seemed to suggest that he did not fully trust them in a radio interview on the topic. BASI memos imply skepticism about Ron Cameron's claims, and they expressed the opinion that he was simply trying to drum up publicity about the affair in order to attract funding for his film. Regardless, like Brian Morris's, the film was never produced, and there were to be no more newspaper articles about the supposed wrecks. The Valentich disappearance was back in the news for different reasons, however, in May of 1983, when BASI received a package from Arthur Withers, the airport manager of Flinders Island, a similarly sized island to King Island, but lying 350 kilometres to its east. The package contained some debris, an engine cowl flap from a Cessna aircraft that had washed up on the beach on Flinders Island, very close to that island's airport runway. The debris had been found by Withers' son Robert, and it was accompanied by a letter that stated that they believed it to be from Fred's Cessna 182L DSJ. The debris was in 3 pieces and heavily eroded, but BASI immediately set about attempting to determine whether it was in fact from Fred's plane. The partial serial number visible on the debris indicated that it came from a range within which DSJ's serial number fell, meaning it was definitely possible that it was DSJ, but not certain. The debris, however, was not buoyant, and so Sandercock wrote to the Royal Australian Navy Research Laboratory to try to understand if it was possible for a piece of debris which could not float to be transported over such a long distance and end up at Flinders Island. In October of 1983, Ian Jones of the Ocean Sciences Division of the RAN Research Laboratory replied that indeed it would be possible for the debris in question to have travelled across the bottom of the sea, particularly during days when the ocean currents were strong. Since almost 5 years had passed since Fred went missing, it would have been entirely possible that this debris could have been carried to Flinders Island in that time. While some are convinced that this cowl flap is almost certainly from Fred's plane, others are not. There had been 2 other known events when Cessna aircraft taking off from Flinders Island Airport had lost the same piece of engine cowl flap. Given that this piece was found so close to the runway, it is believed to be more likely to have come from one of these planes. Modern scientific analysis would be capable of determining whether the piece had been in salt water for 5 years, but unfortunately the debris in question has been lost by the Department of Aviation and so unavailable for testing. In October 1988, Guido received a telephone call from celebrated Australian journalist and television personality Ray Martin. On the phone call, Martin urged Guido to release his copy of the audio tape of Fred's last radio transmission. Guido, unsure as to the legality of such an action, contacted Bassi to inquire as to whether he was still bound by having signed the agreement 6 years previously not to release the audio tape beyond his own immediate family. Sandercock told Guido that the agreement still stood, and as a result, the latter had to disappoint Ray Martin. In 1998, Viewfor's researcher Paul Norman interviewed an anonymous man who claimed to be witness to a startling sighting on the night of Fred's disappearance 20 years previously. The sighting, which the man had not reported at the time, took place on the Great Ocean Road at Barham River, about a kilometre south of Apollo Bay. The anonymous man stated that just beyond the bridge here, he pulled over his car where he and his 2 nieces, looking in an easterly direction towards the sea, observed a Cessna aeroplane slowly descending in a diagonal direction towards the sea. While light was fading as it was dusk, he could clearly make out the Cessna and its distinctive white navigation light and red wingtip light. But more astonishingly, the Cessna was being pursued by a much larger craft, illuminated by a green circular light travelling on top of and slightly to the rear of the Cessna. He and his nieces stood watching this event for half a minute, until both aircraft disappeared from view to the northeast. It was clear that if the Cessna had continued on its diagonally downward trajectory, it would have splashed down in the sea just off the coast near Apollo Bay. Researchers Paul Norman and Richard Haynes then wrote a paper about this sighting, in which they suggested that, based on this witness description, it was highly probable that Fred had changed course when he first encountered the UAP. They hypothesized that Fred became somewhat disoriented when he first saw it, and turned away from King Island and back towards the coast of Victoria. Then, at 7:10 p.m. on the transcript, Fred states, quote, "What I'm doing right now is orbiting, and the thing is just orbiting on top of me," end quote. Norman and Haynes suggested at this point Fred was facing towards the Victorian coast, before doing a complete 360-degree orbit and continuing towards the coast. It was soon after this that Fred reported his engine coughing, at which time, Norman and Haynes suggested, Fred began to lose altitude. The 17 seconds of indecipherable sounds, they suggested, was possibly caused by Fred's plane dropping to an altitude when ground-to-air radio transmission was made impossible due to the curvature of the Earth, preventing a direct line of sight between the radio tower and the aircraft. It is believed Fred continued towards the Victorian coast for several more minutes, all the time losing altitude, and then turned to the right at 7:16 p.m, heading towards the northeast, about 1 to 2 kilometres from the Victorian coast. It was soon after this, they believe, Fred and the UAP were seen by the anonymous man and his nieces, while continuing a gradual diagonal descent, before disappearing beyond their line of sight and splashing down about 6 kilometres out from Apollo Bay at roughly 7:21 p.m. The Norman and Haynes paper concluded by recommending an underwater search be conducted at this location, but as of July 2020, this has not occurred. Sadly, in the year 2000, Fred's father Guido passed away, without ever having found an answer as to what happened to his son on that day in 1978. His mother Alberta and his brother Ricky and sisters Lara and Olivia still travel to Cape Otway each year to remember Fred and are still looking for answers as to what happened to him. In researching this episode, I was contacted by a source who informed me that while it has never been released publicly by what is now called the Air Safety Transport Bureau, formerly BASI, there are in fact multiple copies of the original 13 minutes Valentich Roby audio tape. This source made the claim that an anonymous person who had previously worked for the Department of Transport at Tullamarine Airport had taken recording equipment into their place of work and made a recording of the original non-edited tape. This tape has since fallen into the hands of certain anonymous private UAP researchers. Despite this, these individuals have never released the tape publicly, as technically the tape is the property of the Department of Transport. As of July 2020, Frederick Valentich is still officially listed as a missing person, and as far as we know, nobody knows what happened to him. His family members still hold out hope that one day some evidence will come to light, revealing what his fate was. My name is Eamonn, and you're listening to Melbourne Marvels, a podcast about interesting events that have happened in the Melbourne area throughout history. I'm releasing this podcast in recognition of National Missing Persons Week, in order to highlight the plight of families who suffer from not knowing what happened to their missing loved ones, as is very much the case with Frederick Valentich. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the podcast. You can learn more about the case and view many of the original files of the case at my blog at Melbourne, that's MELBIN, marvels.com. Here I have uploaded many of the original images from both the Department of Transport files and the RAAF files on this case. These were declassified in 2012. If you'd like to reach out to me to ask me about anything in the podcast, please feel free to do so. You can contact me by email on Melbourne, MELBIN, marvels@gmail.com, or you can follow me on Facebook at Melbourne, spelt like the city, Marvels, on Instagram at Melbourne, MELBIN, Marvels, or on Twitter at MELBIN, Marvels. Also, please see my blog post on this case for a list of all of the sources I used in researching this podcast. Most I've already mentioned by name. I'd like to thank Rhonda Rushton for answering the questions I put to her about Fred. I would like to thank George Simpson from the Victorian UFO Action Group for giving his time to discuss the case with me. I'd also like to thank independent researcher Paul Dean for being a valuable source of information on this incident. Paul has been an extremely valuable resource and has discussed the case in depth with me on several occasions over the last few months. So thanks so much, Paul, for your help. I would also like to thank the following musicians from freesound.org for allowing their productions to be used as part of the soundtrack to the podcast. Irokia, I Speak Waves, Sampling Sam the Maryland Man, Joseph Press, and ERH.
So you want to talk about my little adventure?
The mysterious case of Freddie Valentich.
Yeah, well, in my case, I just happened to be at the airport. I'd got a pilot's license, and I was one of the things they want you to do after you've got a pilot's license is to obviously get a lot of experience, and so you go up and you do lots of circuits and practices of various things to get your ratings in, and I'd been increasing my rate because you don't get a license and then you can fly anything. You can get a license and not be able to fly a plane. You just got to go and get the doctor to give you the big tick. And the first thing you do is go and get once you've got your license, you then have to get rated on the different aircraft. And so as a student, the first thing you'd be rated on would be just one of those little dinky toy planes that they learn on.
A Cessna, you mean? Something like that?
No. Well, they can be a Cessna, but they're usually just a very light training aircraft. And at Tyab, they had 150s. The 150s aren't made anymore, but they were just a little two-seater. you and the instructor, and you learned how to fly, you learned how to land and take off and do the various procedures, and then you went off on a flight test, and if you got your license, if you got rated for that plane, then you could go and get rated for another plane. And if you got enough money, you could get rated for a 747, but you need the money. So I'd been, by that stage, I was rated for about 4 different types of planes. The 150 was the training one. And then I got rated for 172, for an Archer, and 182. And the Thai Aero Club, I think it's called Peninsula Aero Club, the chief flying instructor, Harry Baker, was my flying instructor, and he was also rated to teach aerobatics. And one of the things that they like you to do is not so much to learn aerobatics, but learn how to handle a plane in unusual attitudes. You fly into a cloud and you lose orientation, and in no time flat, you're upside down and inside out, and you can pop out of the cloud in any direction, upside down. And so the first thing you learn when you come out of the cloud is, oh shit, where's the horizon? And so you have to learn to recover the aircraft from unusual attitudes.
And you'd not be aware of the aircraft slowly spinning
No,
around?
not at all. The way that they do that is you put a hood on your head, so the only thing you could see is the instruments, and then the instructor will just, he just turns the plane in all sorts of directions. Then he takes his hands off and says, right, there you go. And you open your eyes and go, oh shit, I'm upside down. And so you have to learn how to recover the plane from unusual attitudes. And it's good training. And then on top of all that, because they were teaching people aerobatics, they had I don't remember the guy's name, but they had an old guy, he was about 99 years old, as far as I could tell, but he was a aerobatics inspector. He used to go down along the Frankston Beach and do aerobatics along there. So that's what I took up. I thought, well, this is all right, I can handle this. And it wasn't competition aerobatics, it was just learning how to fly a plane in funny attitudes. And then about the time of this crash, Harry was in the, I don't know if he was in it, but he was part of the police air wing. I think it was a bit like Flying Doctors, they were all volunteer types. And the plane that what's the guy's name? Valentine?
Valentich, yeah.
Yeah, good old Val. He was flying a 182. And the 182 is not an aerobatic aircraft. It's just a, sort of private plane. It's not rated to do aerobatics, but it is rated to do some maneuvers. For instance, you can do rolls, you can do spins.
So can it fly upside down without its wings falling off?
Not for very long, no. It would fly upside down, but the thing about the 182 is that the fuel is fed by a gravity feed, whereas the more powerful aircraft, I think the 210, it actually has a fuel pump. And the 150s and the 172s are all the same. They're all gravity fed. So if you turn them upside down, they'll run while the engine has a little bit of fuel in the carb, but very quickly will die. And the thing about the 182 is you're not really intended to do heavy aerobatics, so you couldn't, do a loop or anything like that. You'd end up with no wing if you tried that. But you can spin it. And Harry was asked to go out and duplicate. They had a theory of what went on, and they wanted Harry to go out and duplicate it for a while. And I think he did it several times. I was only up there for one flight. So we took off from Tyab in a similar 182 flew it out over French Island. That was their nominally their training area, but you could do aerobatic. The thing about flying in around Melbourne is that there are altitude limits because of Tullamarine and all that sort of thing. But over French Island, you could fly to space. I mean, it's unlimited altitude, or it was in those days. And oh, excuse me. And so we went up over French Island. I can't remember how high, probably about 5,000 feet. And so he then started doing some flying around. And what he had to do, in the I didn't get enough through the video to know all the ins and outs of what he did, but apparently he reported that the lights were flying around him, and it kept coming from different directions. And 1 minute it was over him, and then it was under him, and that sort of thing. And they thought that sounded like the aircraft was tumbling.
Yeah.
And so he was asked to go out and take the 182 and put it into an inverted spin, which means the plane's upside down and then fluttering down.
Right.
And of course,
So it's spinning horizontally.
It's spinning horizontally,
yeah,
and that means that there's no airflow over the wings, or the airflow over the wings is disrupted. And the normal way of getting out of a spin is you just use the rudder to correct the spin, and provided you do it quick enough, you don't throw the plane in the reverse spin, because the plane can spin one way and then you correct it, it goes back the other way. And when it's upside down, it needs the engine to give it a bit of a oomph to pull it out of the spin. So you don't want the engine to actually stop while you're upside down. But good old Valley, he reported that the engine was running rough, and they thought, oh, it's becoming fuel starved. So Harry then put the thing into a couple of spins for me, just to show how a Cessna would spin. And then he put it into an inverted spin, which is a bit scary, but it's interesting. And he could only spin it 2 or 3 times. Beyond that, it started to get dangerous. The problem with Cessnas is that they can get into stable spins and you can't get out of them. So once you get into a stable spin, you've got a real problem, particularly as you need an engine to get out of them. And if the engine's stopped, you're in trouble. Yeah. So he was limited to, I think, 3 spins. And
so does this mean effectively that the aircraft didn't have any forward momentum? It was just spinning effectively stationary?
Yeah, it's spinning around its center of gravity, essentially. And the 2 wings, like you've got a wing, but one wing's flying one way and the other wing's flying the other way, and so there's no set lift. And the only way you can get lift is for the engine, and you gun the engine, and that pushes the plane forward a bit, and that throws a bit of air over the port wing, I think it was, and that gives you enough speed to flick the plane up, and so you can recover. So what they wanted to know was, would the engine fail? If you put the thing into a flat spin, would the engine fuel starve? So that's what we did, and sure enough, the engine started to go splutter, and it didn't last very long. And having an engine stop on a light aircraft is not a big deal. People go, oh, it's going to drop out of the sky, but of course it keeps flying. It's just you don't have an engine. And then the moment the fuel is re-established, the engine turns on again. And so we did that. The engine started to splutter and bang, and Harry corrected it. And the moment we corrected it, the engine came good, and we said, oh, that was good. And so he did it again. I think he did it 3 times. And he was quite satisfied that if you put the Cessna 182 into an inverted spin, the engine would stop. And then, because then the engine starts again, it gets some forward motion, and the fuel gets thrown by centrifugal force back into the engine. And so the engine recovers. Doesn't recover for very long, probably, but it recovered enough. And so they were able to duplicate what this chap had described.
But to actually recover from it. So does that mean that either it didn't actually form part of his training, how to get out of?
Oh no, he didn't know what he was doing. Yeah, he was way outside of his experience, and he was flying at night with no horizon, not instrument rated. I mean, this was deadly stuff. It's a bit like these kids that steal cars and go and drive at 200 kilometers an hour. They're just going somewhere to crash.
Yeah.
And that's basically what he was doing. And he did. So he ultimately, he got into a stable inverted spin, and he said, oh, this spacecraft, which they think, I can't remember the town, it might have been Warrnambool Lights. They think he came out of Moorabbin, but he was going to King Island. And they think he might have been seeing lights on the southern coast.
So possibly the Cape Otway Lighthouse.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. But anyway, they think that he was seeing the lights, but because he was spinning, to him they were going around him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you completely lose track of where you are. And I've been in that situation. Part of the training, you very quickly disorientate yourself, and it's hard. You have to practice not believing what your eyes and ears are telling you. Right?
Okay.
You know, the thing about aerobatics is that forces are all over the place, and so you have to learn to fly almost by the seat of your pants. You're flying to the horizon, and in aerobatics you don't lose your horizon.
And of course, at the night time where he was flying, he wouldn't see the horizon in the darkness of Bass Strait.
No, he just saw the lights flying around him, and he wouldn't have recognised that as her horizon, and so he just spun down. And he wasn't that high. I think he said he was only at 4,000 feet or a few thousand feet. Believe me, you could go down and hit the ocean in a matter of seconds from that height. Yeah.
So I presume that when the instructor that you were flying with to test this afterwards flew at a good deal higher height just to be on the safe side.
Yeah, well, from French Island back to Taieb, it's, you only need to be about 2,000 feet. They for safety, they like you to be above 2,000 to fly from the island to the peninsula because you're going over water. But like if you're a couple of 100 feet up, you could glide to the other side if you had to.
Yeah.
So then we just flew back. I think he was required to do a number of tests. I just went up for one, and because I'd been doing aerobatics training and I was there at the right time, he just said, come on in. Like you can sit as a passenger. So I was quite happy to do that, and it was good fun. But I've never been in a plane upside down spinning, and that was a little disconcerting. But
the situation then is that the Cessna's upside down, effectively as if it's being suspended from a twine on the ceiling, turning around.
Yeah, absolutely, and of course, because it's a gravity-fed fuel system, the engine starves of fuel. And when it's spinning, there is a centrifugal force, and the centrifugal force can throw fuel back up the fuel line. And so the engine can get a glump of, like a small glump of fuel will come through.
Yeah.
Is glump a word?
Yeah. I get what you mean.
Anyway, it gulps. I think that's the word I'm after. It gulps the fuel, starts, and then probably would stop again. But we didn't go that far. As soon as the engine restarted, he corrected the plane, and that was it.
Yeah, and of course, if it came down in pieces in Bass Strait, I don't know what the weather was on the day, but
I don't know. He probably didn't break up. He probably just went straight down into the drink. Yeah. And we did the test spinning in both directions. So we did it once spinning starboard, and then again going to port in order to prove that it worked the same way. Either way you went.
Yeah.
And that was good fun. Harry then went on and joined. I think he was already part of the police air wing. but they didn't have any aircraft. The police air wing in those days was, rental stuff. But later on, the Victorian government started buying planes, and so he flew twins and helicopters. And he had a lot of experience. He had several thousand hours of experience on both aircraft and helicopters. And as I said yesterday, he then went on into, I think it was the Department of Lands or somebody doing aerial mapping. And he was required to then fly to some God knows location. They'd give him a latitude and longitude, and then he'd have to fly a pattern around that spot, taking precision photographs. And I remember him telling me that the important thing was he had to be at exactly the right altitude to take the pictures. And then they processed them and come up with a map. I don't know what happened to him. I presume he went on to bigger and better aircraft or whatever.
I suppose in this case, the mystery of the Valentich disappearance is because they never actually found the aircraft afterwards.
No, it's in bits on the bottom of the Bass Strait. Someone will pull it up on a bloody fishing rod one day, and he won't be in it. That's for sure.
But quite a feasible accident then for an inexperienced pilot.
Oh yeah. I think they were quite confident of what happened. That he was just outside of his expertise, flying a plane that he was only barely rated to fly into dark conditions, at night, where he would be required to fly on instruments. And to fly to King Island at night, you definitely have to have an instrument rating. And as you know, my brother-in-law is a commercial pilot, and even he wouldn't do that.
And I'm sure your brother-in-law had a lot more experience than.
Yeah. Well, that's right. That's right. So the old story about there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old bold pilots.
So alas, there's no unidentified flying objects needed in this particular case.
It could be at the bottom of Bass Strait. It might have got in with him. But it's another one of those, because they don't have the smoking gun. It's a little mystery that will carry on forever. I'm sure.
Yes, I think so. If the wreckage had been found, it'd be a different matter, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but even then they'll say, "Oh, but it was brought down by phaser fire."
Well, that's all very good.
Yeah. I hope that wasn't too long.
No. At least helping to put the mystery to bed. But there's nothing like a good mystery story.
Yeah.
Hi all, welcome to Sky for the Month in June 2021. Brought to you by Lockdown 4.0. On with the show. As for the remainder of June and early July highlights, we have on the 11th to the 6th Mercury at inferior conjunction, which I'm aware has already passed. It basically means Mercury is between the Earth and the Sun. However, due to our failure of alignment, we don't get a transit. On the 16th, Comet 7P Pons-Winnicke will be 0.8 degrees south of the Helix Nebula and showing currently at around about 8 magnitude, which will stay for most of the month. Comet 15P Findlay, 0.6 degrees southwest of New Pisces on the 17th of the 6th. So a little bit of comet activity happening this month. On the 18th of the 6th we have the first quarter moon, and of course on the 21st of the 6th we see the solstice, the shortest day of the year. So hopefully as days get longer they'll get a little bit warmer than what they've been. Comet Findlay on the 24th will be half a degree northwest of Z Ceti, I think that's how it's pronounced. And on the 25th we see the full moon. And for those who want to have a reasonable chance of finding Pons Winnicky, it's 1.6 degrees northeast of Fomalhaut on the 26th of the 6th. Now Fomalhaut is a fairly sizable star, fairly easy to find. And on the 1st of the 7th, it moves into the Sculptor. On the 2nd of the 7th, we have our last quarter moon, so we should have slightly darker skies after that. And on the 5th of the 7th, being the fast little object it is, Mercury will be at its greatest elongation west, meaning it will be its best as a morning object. On the 6th of the 7th, Earth will be at aphelion, or its furthest point from the Sun, which probably helps account for the cold weather. And on the 7th of the 7th, Pons Winnicky will be 0.3 degrees northeast of IC 5332, which is a galaxy in the Sculptor. And then on the 10th of the 7th, we have a new moon. Looking at the June sky facing south, we note that we still have a fairly good view of the Milky Way and with all the associated goodness with it, including the Eta Carina Nebula there just below Crux, and Upper Crux itself, as Nerida has been pointing out to us with her phone pics. The Coalsack Nebula, phone picks it up quite well. The Jewel Box, of course, is still there, and Omega Centauri also in a very good spot to be viewed. Moving along a little bit, you've got the Lagoon Nebula up near Sagittarius, and a few other objects in and around the tail of Scorpio. As for the sky looking north, some of the things to in particular note here is if you look just below the teapot, or Sagittarius, you'll see M22. It's a globular cluster, as is M4 right next to Antares. And if you look to the bottom, you will see M3 and M13. These are also globular clusters. These objects, although not as bright as Omega Centauri, are certainly worthwhile objects for those looking to practice a little bit of star crawling towards a target. So, what are the planets up to for the month? Mercury leaves the evening sky during the month and moves through its inferior conjunction on the 11th, which will have already occurred by the time you hear this. It returns as a morning object later in the month, reaching its maximum elongation west on the 5th of July. Gives you a bit of an idea of just how fast Mercury moves around its orbit. Venus is rising in the evening now, and as the month progresses it will actually get higher. Always easy to find, it's the brightest thing in the sky once it's up. Earth, we move through solstice, or will be at solstice on the 21st, which is the shortest day of the year. After that the days will get longer, and I think most of us would hope a little bit warmer. The Sun on this day will be at its most northerly point, and on the 6th of the 7th, as a matter of interest, the Earth is also at aphelion, in other words, its furthest point from the Sun, which probably explains why things are cold. As for the outer planets, Mars is currently in Gemini, moving into Cancer, which makes it fairly low on the western evening horizon. You can still see it in a telescope, but due to its relative distance, there's not a lot of features visible in average-sized telescopes. However, Jupiter is starting to rise late evening, and by that I mean around about just before midnight. And over the next few months it will become an earlier evening object for those not prone to being night owls. Saturn, now in Capricorn, rising mid-evening, and so like Jupiter will start to become a much easier to view evening object. Uranus, still in Aries, basically meaning it is a pre-dawn morning object for the dedicated. still not much more than a little green disk. And Neptune, rising around midnight, is still effectively a morning object for those who have a hankering to have a look at a blue dot. So the appearance of the planets, as you can see from the pictures, we're really looking at the unlit back of Mercury at the moment, and so even if you could see it in conjunction, there would not be too much to see. On the other hand, Venus is coming around from Superior Conjunction, still has a significant amount of its facing the Sun and facing us, so we can see it as quite a large, bright object. Mars is opposite of Venus. It's actually heading away from us now, or rather we're heading away from Mars, and so it's shrinking in size, and I don't think you'd see a great deal of detail even in a fairly sizable telescope. With Saturn moving into the evening sky, it still has its rings tilted towards us, and so puts on the usual specky display. Jupiter, same thing, moving into the evening sky, although you probably need to hang around about until about midnight to see it, but still certainly worth waiting for. Uranus, as I said, still just a little bluey green dot, and Neptune is not much better. Well, it's definitely not better, it's worse, it's just a little blue dot. Moving on to the other stuff, you'll note there's no meteor showers this month, so for those who like meteors, you might have to wait till next month. Comet-wise, we're doing fairly well with Pons Winnicky hanging around at about 8th magnitude. It's rising fairly late evening in Capricorn and then is visible until early morning. It will move back into Aquarius and then finishing the month in the Sculptor. Comet Diarest, visible for most of the night in Hercules and is still around 11th magnitude. And Comet Finley begins the month in Cetus, moves to Pisces, back to Cetus, and ultimately finishes June in Aries. It is predicted to brighten to 10th magnitude. And to finish up tonight's sky for the month with a bit of practical astronomy, meteor showers in the morning. Why do we, every time we look at a meteor shower, the best time to view them seems to be the morning? Has a little bit to do with the movement of the Earth. As you can see from this graphic, that the dawn occurs on the same side of the Earth in the direction that the Earth is actually travelling. As such, the Earth is running into meteorites and effectively sweeps up more of them. Whereas on the dusk side, we're looking in the direction that we've come from, and with the Earth moving through its orbit at just under 68,000 miles an hour, any meteorites on that side have really got to travel pretty quick to catch us. So I guess from this you could actually draw the conclusion that if we're about to run into something as we orbit the Sun, you really don't want to be on the dawn side of the planet. And that concludes Sky for the Month for June 2021. As usual, tonight's information was provided by Astronomy 2021 by Wallace Dawes and Northfield. Thank you all for listening, and hopefully next month it will be back to face to face.
A few months ago, the headline screamed that scientists had found signs of life on Venus. Not this Venus, the other Venus. But it didn't take long for other scientists to raise objections. So just exactly what did they find on Venus? Did they actually find it? And what does it all mean? That's what we'll talk about today. The discovery that made headlines a few months ago was that an international group of researchers said they'd found traces of a molecule called phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus. Phosphine is a molecule made of 1 phosphorus and 3 hydrogen atoms. On planets like Jupiter and Saturn, pressure and temperature are so high that phosphine can form by coincidental chemical reactions, and indeed phosphine has been observed in the atmosphere of these 2 planets. On planets like Venus, however, the pressure isn't remotely large enough to produce phosphine this way. And the only other known processes to create phosphine are biological. On Earth, for example, which in size and distance to the Sun is not all that different to Venus, the only natural production processes for phosphine are certain types of microbes. Lest you think this means that phosphine is somehow good for life, I should add that the microbes in question live without oxygen. Indeed, phosphine is toxic for forms of life that use oxygen, which is most of life on Earth. In fact, phosphine is used in the agricultural industry to kill rodents and insects. So, the production of phosphine on Venus at fairly low atmospheric pressure seems to require life in some sense, which is why the claim that there's phosphine on Venus is big. It could mean there's microbial life on Venus. And just in case microbial life doesn't excite you all that much, this would be super interesting because it would give us a clue to what the chances are that life evolves on other planets in general. So just exactly what did they find? The suspicion that phosphine might be present on Venus is not entirely new. The researchers first saw something that could be phosphine in 2017 in data from the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope, which is a radio telescope in Hawaii. However, this signal was not particularly good, so they did not publish it. Instead, they waited for more data from the ALMA telescope in Chile. Then they published a combined analysis of the data from both telescopes in Nature Astronomy. Here's what they did. One can look for evidence of molecules by exploiting that each molecule reacts to light at different wavelength. To some wavelength, a molecule may not react at all, but others it may absorb because they cause the molecule to vibrate or rotate around itself. It's like each molecule has very specific resonance frequencies. Like if you're sitting in an airplane and the engine's being turned up and then at a certain pitch the whole plane shakes, that's a resonance. For the plane it happens at certain wavelengths of sound, for molecules it happens at certain wavelength of light. So if light passes through a gas like the atmosphere of Venus, then just how much light at each wavelength passes through depends on what molecules are in the gas. Each molecule has a very specific signature, and that makes the identification possible. At least in principle. In practice, it's difficult. That's because different molecules can have very similar absorption lines. For example, the phosphine absorption line, which all the debate is about, has a frequency of 266.944 GHz. But sulfur dioxide has an absorption line at 266.943 GHz. And sulfur dioxide is really common in the atmosphere of Venus. That makes it quite a challenge to find traces of phosphine. But challenges are there to be met. The astrophysicists estimated the contribution from sulfur dioxide from other lines which this molecule should also produce. They found that these other lines were almost invisible. So they concluded that the absorption in the frequency range of interest had to be mostly due to phosphine, and they estimated the amount with about 7 to 20 parts per billion. So that's 7 to 20 molecules of phosphine per billion molecules of anything. It's this discovery which made the big headlines. The results they got for the phosphine amount from the 2 different telescopes are a little different, and such an inconsistency is somewhat of a red flag. But then these measurements were made some years apart, and the atmosphere of Venus could have undergone changes in that period, so it's not necessarily a problem. Unfortunately, after publishing their analysis, the team learned that the data from ALMA had not been processed correctly. It was not their fault, but it meant they had to redo their analysis. With the corrected data, the amount of phosphine they claimed to see fell to something between 1 and 4 parts per billion. Less, but still there. Of course, such an important finding attracted a lot of attention, and it didn't take long for other researchers to have a close look at the analysis. It was not only that finding phosphine was surprising, not finding sulfur dioxide was not normal either. It had been detected many times in the atmosphere of Venus in amounts about 10 times higher than what the phosphine discovery study claimed it was. Already in October last year, a paper came out that argued there's no signal at all in the data, and that said the original study used an overly complicated 12-parameter fit that fooled them into seeing something where there was nothing. This criticism has since been published in a peer-reviewed journal. And by the end of January, another team put out 2 papers in which they pointed out several other problems with the original analysis. First, they used a model of the atmosphere of Venus and calculated that the alleged phosphine absorption comes from altitudes higher than 80 kilometers. Problem is, at such a high altitude, phosphine is incredibly unstable because ultraviolet light from the sun breaks it apart quickly. They estimated it would have a lifetime of under 1 second. This means for phosphine to be present on Venus in the observed amounts, it would have to be produced at a rate higher than the production of oxygen by photosynthesis on Earth. You'd need a lot of bacteria to get that done. Second, they claim that the ALMA telescope should not have been able to see the signal at all, or at least a much smaller signal, because of an effect called line dilution. Line dilution can occur if one has a telescope with many separate dishes, like ALMA. A signal that's smeared out over many of the dishes, like the signal from the atmosphere of Venus, can then be affected by interference effects. According to estimates in the new paper, line dilution should suppress the signal in the ALMA telescope by about a factor 10 to 20, in which case it would not be visible at all. And indeed, they claim that no signal is entirely consistent with the data from the second telescope. This criticism too has now passed peer review. What does it mean? Well, the authors of the original study might reply to this criticism, and so it will probably take some time until the dust settles. But even if the criticism is correct, this would not mean there's no phosphine on Venus. As they say, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If the criticism is correct, then the observations, exactly because they probe only high altitudes where phosphine is unstable, can neither exclude nor confirm the presence of phosphine on Venus. And so the summary is, as so often in science, more work is needed. The interstellar object Oumuamua traveled through our solar system in 2017. Soon after it was spotted, the astrophysicist Avi Lowe claimed it was alien technology. Now it looks like it was just a big chunk of nitrogen. This wasn't the first time scientists yelled aliens mistakenly, and it certainly won't be the last. So in this video, we'll look at the history of supposed alien discoveries. What did astronomers see? What did they think it was? What did it turn out to be in the end? And what are we to make of these claims? That's what we'll talk about today. Let's then talk about all the times when aliens weren't aliens. In 1877, the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli studied the surface of our neighbor planet Mars. He saw a network of long, nearly straight lines. At that time, astronomers didn't have the ability to take photographs of their observations, and the usual procedure was to make drawings and write down what they saw. Schiaparelli called the structures canali in Italian, a word which leaves their origin unspecified. In the English translation, however, the canali became canals, which strongly suggested an artificial origin. The better word would have been channels. This translation blunder made scientific history. Even though the resolution of telescopes at the time wasn't good enough to identify surface structures on Mars, a couple of other astronomers quickly reported they also saw canals. Around the turn of the 90s to the 20th century, the American astronomer Percival Lowell published 3 books in which he presented the hypothesis that the canals were an irrigation system built by an intelligent civilization. The idea that there had once been, or maybe still was, intelligent life on Mars persisted until 1965. In this year, the American space mission Mariner 5 flew by Mars and sent back the first photos of Mars's surface to Earth. The photos showed craters, but nothing resembling canals. The canals turned out to have been imaging artifacts supported by vivid imagination. And even though the scientific community laid the idea of canals on Mars to rest in 1965, it took much longer for the public to get over the idea of life on Mars. I recall my grandmother was still telling me about the canals in the 1980s. But in any case, the friends of ET didn't have to wait long for renewed hope. In 1967, the Irish astrophysicist Jocelyn Bell Burnell noticed that the radio telescope in Cambridge, which she worked on at the time, recorded a recurring signal that pulsed with a period of somewhat more than a second. She noted down LGM on the printout of the measurement curve, short for Little Green Men. The little green men were a joke, of course, but at the time astrophysicists didn't know any natural process that could explain Bell Burnell's observations, so they couldn't entirely exclude that it was a signal stemming from alien technology. However, a few years after the signal was first recorded, it became clear that its origin was not aliens, but a rotating neutron star. Rotating neutron stars can build up strong magnetic fields and then emit a steady but directed beam of electromagnetic radiation. And since the neutron star rotates, we only see this beam if it happens to point into our direction. This is why the signal appears to be pulsed. Such objects are now called pulsars. Then, in 1996, life on Mars had a brief comeback. That year, a group of Americans found a meteorite in Antarctica which seemed to carry traces of bacteria. This rock was probably flung into the direction of our planet when a heavier meteorite crashed into the surface of Mars. Indeed, other scientists confirmed that the Antarctic meteorite most likely came from Mars. However, they concluded that the structures in the rock are too small to be of bacterial origin. That wasn't it with alien sightings. In 2015, the Kepler telescope found a star with irregular changes in its brightness. Officially, the star has the catchy name KIC 8462852, but unofficially it's been called WTF. That stands, as you certainly know, for Where's the Flux? The name which stuck in the end, though, was Tabby Star, after the first name of its discovery, Tabitha Boyorjian. At first, astrophysicists didn't have a good explanation for the odd behavior of Tabby's star. And so it didn't take long until a group of researchers from the University of Pennsylvania proposed aliens are building a megastructure around their star. Indeed, the physicist Freeman Dyson had argued already in the 1960s that advanced extraterrestrial civilizations would try to capture energy from their sun as directly as possible. To this end, Dyson speculated they'd build a sphere around the star. It's remained unclear how such a sphere would be constructed or remain stable, but well, they are advanced, these civilizations, so presumably they've figured it out. And they're covering up their star to catch its energy, and that can quite plausibly lead to a signal like the one observed from Tabby's star. Several radio telescopes scanned the area around Tabby star on the lookout for signs of intelligent life, but didn't find anything. Further observations now seem to support the hypothesis that the star is surrounded by debris from a destroyed moon or other large rocks. Then, in 2017, the Canadian astronomer Robert Warwick made a surprising discovery when he analyzed data from the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii. He saw an object that passed closely by our planet, but it looked neither like a comet nor like an asteroid. When Warwick traced back its path, the object turned out to have come from outside our solar system. Oumuamua, the astronomers named it, Hawaiian for messenger from afar arriving first. Oumuamua gave astronomers and physicists quite something to think. It entered our solar system on a path that agreed with the laws of gravity, with no hints at any further propulsion. But as it got closer to the Sun, it began to emit particles of some sort that gave it an acceleration. This particle emission didn't fit that usually observed from comets. Also, the shape of Oumuamua is rather untypical for asteroids or comets. The shape which fits the data best is that of a disk about 6 to 8 times as wide as high. When Oumuamua was first observed, no one had any good idea what it was made of, or what happened when it got close to the Sun. The astrophysicist Avi Lowe used the situation to claim that Oumuamua is technology of an alien civilization. The simplest, most direct line from an object with all of Oumuamua's observed qualities to an explanation for them is that it was manufactured. That's what he said. According to a new study, it now looks like Oumuamua was a piece of frozen nitrogen that was split off a nitrogen planet in another solar system. It remained frozen until it got close to our Sun, when it began to partly evaporate. Though we will never know exactly, because the object has left our solar system for good and the data we have now is all the data we will ever have. So, what do we learn from that? When new discoveries are made, it takes some time until scientists have collected and analyzed all the data, formulated hypotheses, and evaluated which hypothesis explains the data best. Before that is done, the only thing that can reliably be said is we don't know. But we don't know is boring and doesn't make headlines, which is why some scientists use the situation to put forward highly speculative ideas before anyone else can show they're wrong. This is why headlines about possible signs of extraterrestrial life are certainly entertaining, but usually, after a few years, disappear. A few weeks ago, we talked about false discoveries, scientists who claimed they'd found evidence for alien life. But why is it that we get so easily fooled and jump to conclusions? How bad is it? And what can we do about it? That's what we'll talk about today. My younger daughter had spaghetti for the first time when she was about 2 years old. When I put the plate in front of her, she said, "Hair." The remarkable thing about this is not so much that she said this, but that all of you immediately understood why she said it. Spaghetti are kind of like hair. And as we get older and learn more about the world, we find that other things also look kind of like hair. Willows, for example, or mops. Even my hair sometimes looks like hair. Our brains are pattern detectors. If you've seen one thing, it'll tell you if you come across similar things. Psychologists call this apophenia. We see connections between unrelated things. These connections are not wrong, but they're not particularly meaningful. That we see these connections, therefore, tells us more about the brain than about the things that our brain connects. The famous Rorschach inkblot test, for example, uses apophenia in the attempt to find out what connections the patient readily draws. Of course, these tests are difficult to interpret because if you start thinking about it, you'll come up with all kinds of things for all kinds of reasons. Seeing patterns in clouds is also an example of apophenia. And there are some patterns which we are particularly good at spotting, the ones that are most important for our survival, ahead of all, faces. We see faces everywhere and in everything. Psychologists call this pareidolia. The most famous example may be Jesus on a toast. But there's also Jesus on the butt of that dog. There's a face on Mars, a face in this box, a face in this pepper, and this washing machine has had enough. The face on Mars is worth a closer look to see what's going on. In 1976, the Viking mission sent back images from its orbit around Mars. When one of them looked like a face, a guy by name Richard Hoagland went on TV to declare it was evidence of a lost Martian civilization. But higher resolution images of the same spot from later missions don't look like faces to us anymore. What's going on? What's going on is that when we lack information, our brain fills in details with whatever it thinks is the best matching pattern. That's also what happened, if you remember my earlier video, with the canals on Mars. There never were any canals on Mars. They were imaging artifacts supported by vivid imagination. Michael Shermer, the American science writer and founder of the Skeptic Society, explains this phenomenon in his book The Believing Brain. He writes, "It is in this intersection of non-existing theory and nebulous data that the power of belief is at its zenith and the mind fills in the blanks." He uses as example what happened when Galileo first observed Saturn in 1620. Galileo's telescope at the time had a poor resolution, so Galileo couldn't actually see the rings. But he could see there was something strange about Saturn. It didn't seem to be round. Here's a photo that Geordie Busk took a few months ago with a resolution similar to what Galileo must have seen. What does it look like to you? Galileo claimed that Saturn was a triple planet. Again, what's happening is that the human brain isn't just a passive data analysis machine. The brain doesn't just look at an image and says, I don't have enough data, maybe it's noise or maybe it isn't. No, it'll come up with something that matches the noise, whether or not it has enough data to actually draw that conclusion reliably. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. It's better to see a mountain lion when there isn't one than to not see a mountain lion when there is one. Can you spot the mountain lion? Pause the video before I spoil your fun. It's here. A remarkable experiment to show how we find patterns in noise was done in 2003 by researchers from Quebec and Scotland. They showed images of random white noise to their study participants. But the participants were told that half of those images contained the letter S covered under noise. And sure enough, people saw letters when there weren't any. Here's the fun part. The researchers then took the images which the participants had identified as containing the letter S and overlaid them. And this overlay clearly showed an S. What's going on? Well, if you randomly scatter points on a screen, then every once in a while they will coincidentally look somewhat like an S. If you then selectively pick random distributions that look a particular way and discard the others, you indeed find what you were looking for. This experiment shows that the brain is really good at finding patterns, but it's extremely bad at calculating the probability that this pattern could have come about coincidentally. A final cognitive bias that I want to mention, which is built into our brain, is anthropomorphism. That means we assign agency to inanimate objects. That's why we, for example, get angry at our phones or cars, though that makes absolutely no sense. Anthropomorphism was first studied in 1944 by Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel. They showed people a video in which squares and triangles were moving around, and they found the participants described the videos as if the squares and triangles had intentions. We naturally make up such stories. This is also why we have absolutely no problem with animation movies whose main characters are cars, sponges or potatoes. what does this mean? It means that our brains have a built-in tendency to jump to conclusions and to see meaningful connections when there aren't any. That's why we have astrophysicists who yell "aliens" each time they have unexplained data, and why we have particle physicists who get excited about each little anomaly even though they should full well know that they are almost certainly wasting their time. And it's why, if I hear Beatles songs playing on 2 different radio stations at the same time, I'm afraid Paul McCartney died. Kidding aside, it's also why so many people fall for conspiracy theories. If someone they know gets ill, they can't put it down as an unfortunate coincidence. They will look for an explanation, and if they look, they will find one. Maybe that's some kind of radiation or chemicals or the evil government. Doesn't really matter. The brain wants an explanation. So this is something to keep in mind. Our brains come up with a lot of false positives. We see patterns that aren't there. We see intention when there isn't any. And sometimes we see Jesus on the butt of a dog. Is the Earth flat? Is G5 a mind control experiment by the Russian government? What about the idea that COVID was engineered by the vaccine industry? How can we tell apart science from pseudoscience? This is what we will talk about today. Now, how to tell science from pseudoscience is a topic with a long history that lots of intelligent people have written lots of intelligent things about, but this is YouTube. So instead of telling you what everybody else has said, I will just tell you what I think. And I think the task of science is to explain observations. So if you want to know whether something is science, you need A, observations, and B, you need to know what it means to explain something in scientific terms. What scientists mean by explanation is that they have a model which is a simplified description of the real world, and this model allows them to make statements about observations that agree with measurements. And here's the important bit: the model is simpler than just a collection of all available data. Usually that is because the model captures certain patterns in the data, and any kind of pattern is a simplification. If we have such a model, we say it explains the data, or at least part of it. One of the best historical examples for constructing scientific models is astronomy. Astronomy has been all about finding patterns in the motions of celestial objects. And once you know the patterns, they will quite literally connect the dots. Visually speaking, a scientific model gives you a curve that connects data points. This is arguably oversimplified, but it is an instructive visualization because it tells you when a model stops being scientific. This happens if the model has so much freedom that it can fit any data, because then the model does not explain anything. You would be better off just collecting the data. This is also known as overfitting. If you have a model that has more free parameters as input than data to explain, you may as well not bother with that model. It's not scientific. There is something else one can learn from this simple image, which is that making a model more complicated will generally allow a better fit to the data. So if one asks what is the best explanation of a set of data, one has to ask, when does adding another parameter not justify the slightly better fit to the data you'd get from it? For our purposes, it does not matter just exactly how to calculate this, so let me just say that there are statistical methods to evaluate exactly this. This means we can quantify how well a model explains data. Now, all of what I just said was very quantitative, and not in all disciplines of science are models quantitative. But the general point holds. If you have a model that requires many assumptions to explain few observations, and if you hold on to that model, even though there is a simpler explanation, then that is unscientific. And needless to say, if you have a model that does not explain any observation, then that is also not scientific. A typical case of pseudoscience are conspiracy theories. Whether that is the idea that the Earth is flat, but NASA has been covering up the evidence since the days of Ptolemy's at least, or that G5 is a plan by the government to mind control you using secret radiation, or that COVID was engineered by the vaccine industry for profit, all these ideas have in common that they are contrived. You have to make a lot of assumptions for these ideas to agree with reality. Assumptions like somehow it's been possible to consistently fake all the data and images of around Earth and brainwash every single airline pilot, or it is possible to control other people's mind, and yet somehow that has not prevented you from figuring out that minds are being controlled. These contrived assumptions are the equivalent of overfitting. That's what makes these conspiracy theories unscientific. The scientific explanations are the simple ones, the ones that explain lots of observations with few assumptions. The Earth is round. G5 is a wireless network. Bats carry many coronaviruses. These have jumped over to humans before, and that's most likely where COVID also came from. Let us look at some other popular example, Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is a good scientific theory because it connects the dots, basically by telling you how certain organisms evolved from each other. I think that in principle it should be possible to quantify this fit to data, but arguably no one has done that. Creationism, on the other hand, simply posits that Earth was created with everything in place. That means creationism puts in as much information as you get out of it. It therefore does not explain anything. This does not mean it's wrong, but it means it is unscientific. Another way to tell pseudoscience from science is that a lot of pseudoscientists like to brag with making predictions. But just because you have a model that makes predictions does not mean it's scientific. And the opposite is also true. Just because a model does not make predictions does not mean it is not scientific. This is because it does not take much to make a prediction. I can predict, for example, that one of your relatives will fall ill in the coming week. And just coincidentally, this will be correct for some of you. Are you impressed? Probably not. Why? Because to demonstrate that this prediction was scientific, I'd have to show it was better than a random guess. For this, I'd have to tell you what model I use and what the assumptions were. But of course, I didn't have a model, I just made a guess. And the simplest explanation that I was right is that I was coincidentally right. A model that does not make predictions can still be scientific if it explains a lot of already existing data. Pandemic models are actually a good example for scientific models which do not make predictions. It is basically impossible to make predictions for the spread of infectious diseases because that spread depends on policy decisions which themselves cannot be predicted. So with pandemic models, we really make projections, or we can look at certain scenarios that are if-then cases. If we do not cancel large events, then the spread will likely look like this. If we do cancel them, the spread will more likely look like that. It's not a prediction because we cannot predict whether large events will be cancelled, but that does not make these models unscientific. They are scientific because they accurately describe the spread of epidemics on record. These are simple explanations that fit a lot of data, and that's why we use them in the first place. The same is the case for climate models. The simplest explanation for our observation, the one that fits the data with the least amount of assumptions, is that climate change is due to increasing carbon dioxide levels and caused by humans. That's what the science says. So if you want to know whether a model is scientific, ask how much data it can correctly reproduce and how many assumptions were required for this. Having said that, it can be difficult to tell science from pseudoscience if an idea has not yet been fully developed and you're constantly being told it's promising, but no one can ever actually show the model fits to data because they say they are not done with the research. We see this in the foundations of physics most prominently with string theory. String theory, if it would work as advertised, could be good science. But string theorists never seem to get to the point where the idea would actually be useful. In this case then, the question is really a different one, Namely, how much time and money should you throw at a certain research direction to even find out whether it's science or pseudoscience. And that, ultimately, is a decision that falls to those who fund that research. Today I want to talk about a topic that is much more important than anything I have previously talked about. And that's how cognitive biases prevent science from working properly. Cognitive biases have received some attention in recent years thanks to books like Thinking Fast and Slow, You Are Not So Smart, or Blind Spot. Unfortunately, this knowledge has not been put into action in scientific research. Scientists do correct for biases in statistical analysis of data, and they do correct for biases in their measurement devices, but they still do not correct for biases in the most important apparatus that they use, their own brain. Before I tell you what problems this creates, here's a brief reminder what a cognitive bias is. A cognitive bias is a thinking shortcut which the human brain uses to make faster decisions. Cognitive biases work much like optical illusions. Take this example of an optical illusion. If your brain works normally, then the square labeled A looks much darker than the square labeled B. But if you compare the actual color of the pixels, you see that the squares have exactly the same color. The reason that we intuitively misjudge the color of these squares is that the image suggests it is really showing a three-dimensional scene where part of the floor is covered by a shadow. Your brain factors in the shadow and calculates back to the original color, correctly telling you that the actual color of square B must have been lighter than that of square A. So if someone asked you to judge the color in a natural scene, your answer would be correct. But if your task was to evaluate the color of pixels on the screen, you would give a wrong answer, unless you know of your bias and therefore do not rely on your intuition. Cognitive biases work the same way and can be prevented the same way, by not relying on intuition. Cognitive biases are corrections that your brain applies to input to make your life easier. We all have them, and in everyday life they are usually beneficial. The maybe best known cognitive bias is attentional bias. It means that the more often you hear about something, the more important you think it is. This normally makes a lot of sense. Say, if many people you meet are talking about the flu, chances are the flu's making the rounds and you are well advised to pay attention to what they're saying and get a flu shot. But attentional bias can draw your attention to false or irrelevant information. For example, if the prevalence of a message is artificially amplified by social media, causing you to misjudge its relevance for your own life. A case where this frequently happens is terrorism. It receives a lot of media coverage, has people usually worried, but if you look at the numbers, for most of us, terrorism is very unlikely to directly affect our life. And this attentional bias also affects scientific judgment. If a research topic receives a lot of media coverage or scientists hear a lot about it from their colleagues, those researchers who do not correct for attentional bias are likely to overrate the scientific relevance of the topic. There are many other biases that affect scientific research. Take, for example, loss aversion. This is more commonly known as throwing good money after bad. It means that if we have invested time or money into something, we are reluctant to let go of it and continue to invest in it, even if it no longer makes sense. Because getting out would mean admitting to ourselves that we made a mistake. Loss aversion is one of the reasons scientists continue to work on research agendas that have long stopped being promising. But the most problematic cognitive bias in science is social reinforcement, also known as groupthink. This is what happens in almost closed, like-minded communities if you have people reassuring each other that they are doing the right thing. they will develop a common narrative that is overly optimistic about their own research, and they will dismiss opinions from people outside their own community. Groupthink makes it basically impossible for researchers to identify their own mistakes, and therefore stands in the way of the self-correction that is so essential for science. A bias closely linked to social reinforcement is the shared information bias. This bias has the consequence that we are more likely to pay attention to information that is shared by many people we know, rather than to the information held by only few people. You can see right away how this is problematic for science. That's because how many people know of a certain fact tells you nothing about whether that fact is correct or not. And whether some information is widely shared should not be a factor for evaluating its correctness. Now, there are lots of studies showing that we all have these cognitive biases, and also that intelligence does not make it less likely to have them. It should be obvious then that we organize scientific research so that scientists can avoid or at least alleviate their bias. Unfortunately, the way that research is currently organized has exactly the opposite effect. It makes cognitive biases worse. For example, it is presently very difficult for scientists to change their research topic because getting a research grant requires that you document expertise. Likewise, no one will hire you to work on a topic you do not already have experience with. Superficially, this seems like a good strategy to invest money into science, because you reward people for bringing expertise. But if you think about the long-term consequences, it is a bad investment strategy, because now not only do researchers face a psychological hurdle to leaving behind a topic they have invested time in, they would also cause themselves financial trouble. As a consequence, researchers are basically forced to continue to claim that their research direction is promising and to continue working on topics that lead nowhere. Another problem with the current organization of research is that it rewards scientists for exaggerating how exciting their research is and for working on popular topics, which makes social reinforcement worse and adds to the shared information bias. I know this all sounds very negative, but there's good news too. Once you are aware that these cognitive biases exist and you know the problems that they can cause, it is easy to think of ways to work against them. For example, researchers should be encouraged to change topics rather than basically being forced to continue what they are already doing. Also, researchers should always list shortcomings of their research topics in lectures and papers so that the shortcomings stay on the collective consciousness. Similarly, conferences should always have speakers from competing programs, and scientists should be encouraged to offer criticism on their community and not be avoided for it. These are all little improvements that every scientist can make individually, and once you start thinking about it, it's not hard to come up with further ideas. The reason this is so important to me is that science drives innovation, and if science does not work properly, then progress in our societies will slow down. But cognitive bias in science is a problem we can solve and that we should solve. Now you know how.